Okay, this paper is called Aristotle, the United Nations, and the Creation of Civil Society. So each of the papers that have Aristotle UN in the title are going to either start with or include the capabilities model of development. So there's some redundancy, but that's so the paper actually stands alone. People don't have to just look at the videos in order. So I hope you'll bear with me. If you've already seen the other Aristotle UN paper, there's going to be some repetition here. If you haven't, then the paper will make sense on its own. In Women and Human Development, Dr. Martha Nussbaum uses the human capabilities model for international development. She explains why the capabilities model is better than the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights as a standard by which to determine if a nation is being ruled justly. The ruling class is just if it does everything it can to cultivate the capabilities of as many citizens as possible. The following is an abbreviated version of her list of capabilities. First, life, being able to live to the end of a human life of normal length, not dying prematurely or before one's life is so reduced as to be not worth living. 2. Bodily health, being able to have good health, including reproductive health, to be adequately nourished, to have adequate shelter. 3. Bodily integrity, being able to move freely from place to place, having one's bodily boundaries treated as sovereign. 4th, senses, imagination, and thought, being able to use the senses to imagine, think, and reason, and to do these things in a truly human way, a way informed and cultivated by an adequate education. 5th, emotions, being able to have attachments to things and people outside ourselves, to love those who love and care for us. 6th, practical reason, being able to form a conception of the good and to engage in critical reflection about the planning of one's life. 7th, affiliation, being able to live with and toward others, to recognize and show concern for other human beings, to have the capability for both justice and friendship, being able to be treated as a dignified being whose worth is equal to that of others. In work, being able to work as a human being, exercising practical wisdom. 8th, other species, being able to live with concern for and in relation to animals, plants, and the world of nature. 9th, control over one's environment. First, political, being able to participate effectively in political choices that govern one's life, free speech and association. 2nd, material, being able to hold property in terms of real opportunity and having property right on an equal basis with others." Unquote. Nussbaum further explains the close connection between the UN's capability models and both Aristotle's view of the powers of the human soul and Karl Marx's view of species being. The UN, Aristotle, and Marx all agree that a just society is one that develops the capabilities of its citizens. All three would agree that over the course of human history, more and more people have been able to recognize their innate capabilities and have begun to demand that their rulers give them the opportunity to develop them. Although I cannot do a complete analysis of all the capabilities, the most basic human capabilities are the least controversial, beginning with the natural drive for food, drink, sex, clothing, and shelter, the need to survive. According to Aristotle, the virtue in relation to these drives is temperance or self-control, the desire to want enough but not too much of any of these things. Aristotle understood the power of greed in human affairs. He condemned greed, the desire for more than one's share, as a political evil, because when citizens are greedy, they learn how to use the wealth they have to get richer. Those who have money get more. Those who do not get less. Animosity between the rich and powerful leads to instability and a failure to properly develop and educate the higher order capabilities in any of the citizens. Aristotle did not think the problem of greed could be solved either by the elimination of private property or by a completely unregulated economic system. He argued that the best societies are those in which the citizens realize that they need to develop their higher order capabilities and to encourage the same development in others. Citizens choose to work hard, live middle-class lives, and use their extra time and wealth to help others, creating long-term stability and a collective sense of well-being. The particular institutional structure of any society can be used justly or unjustly, depending upon the desires and values of the people. Karl Marx claimed that a capitalist economic system necessarily leads to intemperance. It cannot maintain itself unless it cultivates greed. Capitalism depends on a competitive and adversarial spirit between citizens. It's based on the assumption that the best way to motivate people to work hard is to honor them for becoming wealthy and to promise them they will not have to share the fruits of their labor. Those with enough money can set up institutions, especially educational institutions, that give those wealthy enough the opportunity to develop all of their higher order capabilities. These institutions, in turn, develop the capabilities of the rich, those who can pay for their services. Marx argues that a state-run economic system is a better way to cultivate human capabilities in all citizens. Such a system will provide the basics so that citizens do not have to worry about surviving. Communist society is based on cultivating a cooperative spirit among citizens. Citizens are taught to want to share and care about the well-being of others, and they are publicly honored when they work hard and give back to others. When people have enough and want to work together, leaders can more effectively establish institutions that provide opportunities for all citizens to develop their higher order capabilities. The famous quote was, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs." Recent history has shown that neither a free market economy nor a completely state-controlled economy will lead to the best way to ensure the development of human capabilities. As the world's nations move toward a non-ideological, pragmatic approach to the relation between private creation of wealth and government distribution of wealth, it becomes obvious that every nation depends on the temperance of both leaders and citizens. The economic sector of any society will become corrupt if people want more than they need. A society whose citizens are willing both to work hard and to share will have a cultural climate in which citizens together are engaged in the process of developing their higher order capabilities. Although the capabilities model does not explicitly say so, temperance is a necessary foundation for the cultivation of the other capabilities. Another important virtue is courage, the development of a high level of human excellence in relation to the experience of fear. Human beings are by nature vulnerable, so they experience fear in many different kinds of situations. They experience physical fear, the fear of pain, illness, old age, and death. They experience fear when those they love suffer in the same ways. Spouses, parents, and children, or close friends. They fear loss of a job and the suffering of those who depend on them to survive. They fear attacks from other nations and the dangers when fighting to protect their nations. They fear loss of social respectability or even political persecution for questioning their leaders or fellow citizens. Aristotle defines the virtue of courage as the ability to face fears and to do so for the right reason, in the right way, at the right time, and so on. In a society of citizens who are temperate and just, citizens will have less to fear. In a society of greedy and unjust citizens, everyone will have more to fear. Human vice, the desire for more than one's share, is ultimately self-destructive, for both individuals and societies. Aristotle's definitions of the virtues should make it clear that every human being experiences situations in which they have the capability to respond appropriately, to hit the mean between extremes, or to miss the mark, to fail to do what's best. Further, a society of citizens who cultivate these virtues or higher level capabilities will be a much better place to live than a society that ignores the need to cultivate the virtues. Besides temperance and courage, gentleness also has to be cultivated in children from when they're very young. Gentleness is the mean in relation to situations that require a decision about whether or not it is appropriate to be angry, toward whom, for how long, for what reason, in what way, etc. As people get older, their lives get more complicated, so they need to develop the capabilities related to a higher level of responsibility. Generosity is the mean in relation to giving away money. Appropriate ambition is the mean in relation to the desire to achieve status, power, and wealth, worldly success. Pride is the mean in relation to understanding one's own quality of character and the appropriate degree of social respect one deserves. Self-knowledge is the ability to evaluate one's strengths and weaknesses without either overestimating or underestimating oneself. Sociability is the mean in relation to being friendly in social situations, so that citizens learn to trust and respect each other. People's characters are profoundly affected by their bonds with other people. Aristotle takes friendships very seriously. Friendliness is the mean in relation to treating others appropriately based on the nature of the relationship. Some friendships are between unequals, such as the relationship between children and parents, employers and employees, ruler and ruled. Some friendships are between equals, such as siblings and fellow citizens. Some friendships are based on utility, such as the relationship between a business owner and a customer, and the common bond is to meet a basic human need. Some friendships are based on pleasure only, such as the short-term friendships young people have, bound together to party or relax. The best friendships are based on the common pursuit of a human good, intellectual or cultural pleasures, the pleasure of donating money, doing volunteer work, engaging in actions that require the exercise of practical wisdom, such as fighting together in a just war, ruling together, running an organization justly together, or meeting together to cultivate understanding and good judgment. To use the language of capabilities, our higher level capabilities are developed and exercised in relation to other people, especially in relationships with people we know and love. The political virtues are those we exercise in relation to people we do not know personally, fellow citizens with whom we share a common set of laws and institutions. The virtues connected to this level of human interaction are, first, the ability to find the middle ground in relation to the pleasure that comes from making profit. That's the economic sector. Two, making good judgments about how to provide goods and services needed by every citizen, such as education and health care. Three, the ability to make good judgments about how to rectify wrongs involving the creation, application, and enforcement of criminal law. Fourth, the art of legislation, making laws that ensure the well-being of all citizens. And fifth, equity, the ability to apply the laws well in a given situation. These virtues correspond to the capabilities for political control over one's environment and affiliation. Clearly, I cannot systematically show the many links between the capabilities model, Aristotle's theory of the virtues, and Marx's notion of species being. Readers should be able to see the connections. The capabilities model focuses on what citizens have a right to expect rulers to provide. The list of virtues focuses on what citizens must do to develop their capabilities once they are given the opportunity to do so. In the rest of this paper, I will give examples of the complicated dynamic between individuals, social and political institutions, and the cultivation of human capabilities. My conclusion will be that citizens who believe that the cultivation of capabilities is the goal of human life must use the power they have to act in ways that promote this goal and must avoid acting in ways that undermine it. More and more people today have the freedom to make choices about how to live. Collectively, we need to recognize that the choices we make in our personal lives determine whether our societies become more stable or less stable. When we abuse our freedom and behave irrationally, our societies become less stable, leading to less stability between nations. Instability gives power-hungry individuals the opportunity to use their society's institutions to consolidate their power, leading to the oppression of the many by the few. And they often use fear. They appeal to fear and manipulate it when things get unstable and people are afraid. In an age of the cultivation of global civilization, we must all choose to do what we can to prevent the need for centralized power. We must develop our capabilities in a way that leads to virtue and complete human excellence. The exercise of the individual virtues leads to a better quality of social and political life within a nation and between nations. My first example concerns food. Many of the world's people do not have enough to eat. There are many causes: overpopulation, corrupt leaders, a polluted environment, and so forth. In the United States, however, people have the opportunity to eat enough healthy food, yet they become unhealthy because of what they choose to eat. The causes are a combination of, first, the irrational desires of the people; second, the systematic cultivation of irrational desires for the sake of excess profit in the business sector; third, the control of the political process by the largest businesses. Businesses make money by selling people unhealthy food, making them fat, selling them diet products, making them sick, selling them medicines, and ultimately giving them heart disease, heart attacks, diabetes, leading to a systematically created need for highly paid doctors to perform complicated operations. The profit motive has thus undermined the human need to eat healthy foods. Given this kind of dynamic, it's possible to argue that more governmental control of the food industry would be a more just way to develop the human capability for health coming from good eating. In a society dominated by business, however, the legal system is corrupted by greed. Politicians need gigantic sums of money to win elections, which they get from huge corporations, and those corporations demand that the laws and the application and enforcement of the laws favor their interests. Government subsidies reward farmers for planting crops like corn, which lowers the price of corn syrup used in the production of addicted junk foods and lots of foods. Junk foods cost less than healthy foods. The price of other necessary goods and services is based on the assumption that citizens are using a certain percentage of their income on this so-called food. Many people cannot afford to buy healthy food unless they spend a much larger percentage of their income on food than most other people do, making them unable to pay for other necessities. Perhaps worst of all, the corporations selling the processed foods are exporting them to the rest of the world. They use their wealth to support those lawmakers and political rulers who promote their interests everywhere without concern for the well-being of all citizens. Within every nation, a small elite becomes more and more powerful. What is the solution? First, citizens must become aware of the complexity of the problem. Then we must collectively stop seeking an easy solution by blindly espousing either a free market economy or a controlled economy. Either one can be corrupt. Second, corporate executives, politicians, and ordinary consumers need to recognize that their own irrational behavior is leading to the creation of a local, national, and international culture that will ultimately undermine the quality of their lives. For short-term gain, they're creating the conditions for long-term loss. Unhealthy citizens, nations in debt due to healthcare costs, and animosity and competition between citizens and between nations. Third, citizens around the world must work toward collective solutions, ways to work within the social systems we have to provide alternatives and to educate the public in how to gain access to those alternatives. Education about nutrition, exposure of corruption, the legislation of incentives to provide alternatives, public media campaigns to counter private sector mass advertising. All these are possible and necessary. A collective recognition of the problem is the first step in working toward a solution. Next section, creating art that educates the citizen for wisdom. Cultivating the capabilities of sensation, imagination, and thought. Corruption can occur when citizens and leaders aim to develop their higher order capacities and those of their fellows through arts education. The UN, Aristotle, and Marx would agree on the importance of educating as many citizens as possible. Such an education includes both learning the kinds of knowledge and gaining skills that lead to stable employment, and education that develops higher order capabilities, including knowledge in the sciences and social sciences, participation in and appreciation of artistic creation, and critical thinking. However, a good education costs money. How can societies today establish institutions of higher learning without using too many resources to educate only a few while ignoring the more basic needs and capabilities of the many? Tolstoy's discussion of ballet and classical music in his book What is Art exposes how the cultivation of the arts, an activity that ought to develop human capabilities, can be organized and administered in a way that is a corrupting influence on everyone involved. I will quote extensively from Tolstoy because every nation and culture today, rich and poor, developed or underdeveloped, either does address or ought to address all of the issues he discusses. First, Tolstoy claims that artistic expression is natural and necessary for human well-being. Translated into the language of capabilities, Tolstoy would agree that capability number 4, senses, imagination, and thought, is indeed a human necessity. Quote, being able to use the senses to imagine, think, and reason, and to do these things in a truly human way, a way informed and cultivated by an adequate education. That's the capabilities definition. Tolstoy's claim is that real art is never detached from capabilities number 5 and 6. Number 5 says, being able to have attachments to things and people outside ourselves, to love those who love and care for us. That's called emotions. Number 6, practical reason, states, being able to form a conception of the good and to engage in critical reflection about the planning of one's life, unquote. Tolstoy describes the way the arts, as defined by his society, are really pseudo-art. They are not only a distraction, but they pervert the natural human capability and need for true artistic expression and community response to that expression. Quote, this is Tolstoy. The diffusion of our society of enormous quantities of, on the one hand, those counterfeits of art which only serve to amuse and corrupt people, and, on the other hand, of works of insignificant, exclusive art have perverted most men's capacity to be infected by true works of art, and have thus deprived them of the possibility of experiencing the highest feelings to which humankind has attained, and which can only be transmitted from person to person by art." Unquote. Tolstoy then lists the consequences of this perversion. The effect on working class people is terrible. Quote, "The first consequence is the enormous expenditure of the labor of working people on things which are not only useless, but which for the most part are harmful, and more than that, the waste of priceless human lives on this unnecessary and harmful business. Millions of people who lack time and opportunity to attend to what they and their families urgently require labor for 10, 12, or 14 hours on end, and even at night, setting the type for pseudo-artistic books which spread vice among humankind, or working for theaters, concerts, exhibitions, and picture galleries, which for the most part also serve vice." Unquote. The effect on the children of the rich is equally bad. Quote, "It is yet more terrible to reflect that lively, kindly children, capable of all that is good, are devoted from their early years to such tasks as these, that for 6, 8, or 10 hours a day, and for 10 or 15 years, some of them should play scales and exercises, others should twist their limbs, walk on their toes, often continued long after maturity. They should waste their physical and mental strength and lose all perception of the meaning of life." Unquote. Besides the effect on their bodies, these activities corrupt their souls. Quote, "Occupying in society the role of amusers of the rich, they lose their sense of human dignity and develop in themselves such a passion for public applause that they are always a prey to inflated and unsatisfied vanity, which grows for the sake of art. They are spoiled for life." Unquote. Second is the effect on the audiences. Quote, "The productions of amusement art enable the rich people of our times to live the lives they do, lives not only unnatural, but in contradiction to the humane principles these people themselves profess. What is called art hides from them the meaninglessness of their lives." The third consequence is, quote, "the perplexity produced in the minds of children and of plain folk. They see that singers, composers, painters, ballet dancers earn millions of roubles and receive more honor than the saints do, and peasants and children are perplexed." Fourth, the upper classes, more and more frequently encountering the contradictions between beauty and goodness, put the ideal of beauty first, thus freeing themselves from the demands of morality. Fifth, perverted art, quote, "has a directly vitiating influence, infecting people with the worst feelings and with those most harmful to humanity, superstition, patriotism, and above all, sensuality." Unquote. As the process of globalization intensifies, every human being in every society will have to determine how the artistic and cultural life of their society should develop. These dangers are real and have a pervasive effect on a society. However, censorship and a more authoritarian government is not the best way to solve the problem. In spite of the corruption of the arts in his time, Tolstoy did not condemn all art, however, and neither should we. Instead, he developed a new theory of art. First, he defines art, quote, "to call up in oneself a feeling once experienced it, and having called it up, to convey it by means of movements, lines, colors, sounds, images expressed in words, so that others experience the same feeling. In this consists the activity of art. Art is that human activity which consists in one person's consciously conveying to others, by certain external signs, the feelings he has experienced, and in others being infected by those feelings and also experiencing them." Unquote. Next, Tolstoy defines the content of true art. Quote, "The relations between spouses, of parents to children, of children to parents, the relations of people to their compatriots, to foreigners, to attack, defense, property, land, animals, new, complex, touching, and infinitely varied feelings." Third, Tolstoy ties true art to what the capabilities model calls practical reason, a person's understanding of the meaning of life. Quote, "The appreciation of the merits of art, that is, of the feelings it conveys, depends upon people's understanding of the meaning of life, on what they see as good and evil in life." Tolstoy argues that practical reason is always some form of religious consciousness. Quote, "Religions are indicators of the highest understanding of life accessible at a given time in a given society to the best of the leading people." Unquote. Tolstoy argues that authentic Christianity, the real Christian message, is the highest form of religious consciousness. Quote, "True Christianity, the direct relation of each person to the Father, and, following from that, the brotherhood and equality of all people, resulting in the replacement of all forms of violence by humility and love." Unquote. Tolstoy would reject religious intolerance, however. Instead, he would make all religious and philosophical traditions and claims accountable to reason. They would be judged as legitimate or illegitimate on the basis of the message they convey, through theological treatises and especially through art that appeals to senses and imagination. Art is not legitimate based on whether it is supposedly religious or not, or which religious images it's based on. Rather, the two classes of legitimate art are, quote, "religious art which conveys feelings coming from a religious consciousness of humanity's position in the world with regard to God and his neighbor, and universal art which conveys the simplest everyday feelings of life, such as are accessible to everyone in the world." Unquote. Tolstoy's definition of the purpose of art in his time is also true today. He says, quote, "The purpose of art in our time consists in transferring from the realm of reason to the realm of feeling the truth that people's well-being lies in being united among themselves and in establishing, in place of the violence that now reigns, that kingdom of God, that is, of love, which we all regard as the highest aim of human life." Unquote. Nations that are developing to the point at which they can provide some funding for leisure activities that promote the human capabilities beyond mere survival needs have to wrestle with the problems and issues Tolstoy describes. Developed nations that have to cut back funding for the arts and other cultural events also have to wrestle with what to fund and what not to fund. As each nation's leaders, both government leaders who provide government funding and the wealthy who donate to higher education and the arts, wrestle with these issues, they will have to ask the same questions Tolstoy asked himself. How do we distinguish between real art and pseudo-art? Between art and pseudo-arts that are really just entertainment? Between art and pseudo-arts that demand leisure time and excess wealth and are really propaganda to justify extreme wealth? Between art and pseudo-arts that are really political propaganda? between art and pseudo-arts that are really religious propaganda, between art and all other products of the human capability for creativity that pervert this capacity to nurture irrational emotions and prejudices. How can we ensure that the context in which great art is presented to the public promotes rather than undermines human well-being? Sometimes truly great art is presented as a way to find common ground and to learn from the great insights of the past. Other times it is produced as a way for those wealthy enough to study it to justify their cultural superiority, hence their privilege. In the name of social justice, should we censor high art like ballet and opera? Anyone who's attended a ballet or gone to an opera would probably be appalled at this suggestion. Instead, how can we make it accessible to the broader public? At the other extreme, should we condemn Hollywood or Bollywood because they are vulgarizing our aesthetic taste, hence our emotional lives, leading to an inability to form close relationships and to become good citizens? Should we suggest any government control over the human capacity for creativity of any kind? The UN, Aristotle, and Marx would probably all agree that the best solution would be to educate the youth in the liberal arts so they can discriminate between art and propaganda and learn the lessons that great art teaches. Of course, Stalin abused Marx, but if you just look at Marx, the cultivation of capabilities. In theory, even though a great deal of censorship took place in Marxist countries, Marx's view would be similar. Marxist rulers claimed that most of what had passed as civilization in the past was really just propaganda designed to justify the continued wealth and privilege of the upper class. In the name of representing the masses, Marxist rulers created their own art that promoted supposedly the love of the common good. In theory, the proletariat was in charge and represented the rule of reason and what was best to promote a strong middle class. In practice, the cultivation of the capabilities of citizens was controlled way too much. The arts and artists were forced to serve the interests of those in power, as it had been before. It's political propaganda. The only difference was that this time the powerful claimed to support and protect the people, but control of the arts leads to the shutdown of free intellectual inquiry and a free imagination, hence the end of a continual process of self-examination within and between citizens as they live out all their social roles. Without a continual process of critical self-examination, transparency between those with power and those without it, the powerful will abuse their power, and they will use the arts and our power of creativity to further that abuse. Every society that wants to avoid absolute authority, every society that wants to promote the cultivation of the capabilities of all citizens, must institutionalize and promote the arts and the liberal arts. The goal of this kind of education should be to create a body of citizens who will hold themselves and each other accountable for exercising their power justly. Such an education ought to enable citizens to recognize corruption in leaders and efforts to manipulate people through deceitful rhetoric and irrational appeals to fear. However, the problem with the solution of educating citizens in the arts and liberal arts so that they will become wise is this: who will determine what wisdom is, and who, in fact, possesses this quality of character? Who are the disinterested, rational judges who will honor and promote the ambitions of those who will use their power to promote the well-being of all citizens? Historically, too often, those in charge use rhetoric to convince citizens to give them authority, and then abuse their power and privilege. they do not exercise practical wisdom. This is true for every society: a communist society, a free society, a democracy, a monarchy, an oligarchy, or any other form of constitution. The only real solution is to stop looking for a single solution and to recognize our universal need to continually examine and re-examine what to do in any given situation, always with the goal of developing human capabilities and a strong and stable middle class. This is no easy task, and there's no permanent solution. Trying to find a perfect and permanent solution in any set of laws or ruling elite only distracts citizens from engaging in the difficult activity of exercising practical wisdom day in and day out in every facet of life. Next section, Aristotle and Religious Association, cultivating the capability of practical wisdom and developing a worldview. Tolstoy's discussion of religious consciousness and the arts is clearly connected to Marx's view of religion. The Russian people, it seems, might have always thought that Marx rejected all religion instead of just rejecting the corruption of religion. When the USSR collapsed, many citizens returned to their religious heritage and embraced the values and ideas about the human condition espoused by the Orthodox and other religious traditions. The fact that the Soviet leaders could never eliminate religious consciousness from the people indicates the importance of the capability of practical reason. Every government should allow citizens to exercise this capability as freely as possible until it intervenes with the cultivation of other capabilities. Marx did not focus on the true spirit of religious consciousness and its expression through art, as Tolstoy did. Rather, Marx looked at the institution of the church and the many ways it used and uses pseudo-religious belief to perpetuate the oppression of the poor and working class. Marx observed the way the leaders of religious institutions pretended to have supernatural knowledge of divine deities and used their authority to tell people they should accept unjust treatment in this world because they would be rewarded in the next. Marx decided that all religious claims are simply the opiate of the masses, a rhetorical tool to manipulate the oppressed. Marx's thinking followed many tenets of the Enlightenment, including the claim that the human psyche is purely physical, the union of genetics and environment. Further, if human beings simply face the fact that they're molded by cultures of their own making, they will be motivated to create societies that mold people to care about each other, leading to the same kind of brotherly love Tolstoy claimed was the true essence of religious consciousness. By trying to create a purely secular, atheistic society, however, Marx rejected any truly rational and universal standard by which a society, any society, can be evaluated as just or unjust. Marx assumed that when the proletariat took over the means of production, the need for power and abuses of power would decrease and eventually wither away. The absence of a natural international standard for justice was mistaken for two reasons. First, Marx denied the need for human beings to acknowledge their place within the broader context of the natural world. For Aristotle, practical wisdom required the recognition of natural forces and the use of practical wisdom to determine when those powers can be harnessed for human well-being, and the respect in which culture must develop within the context of unchanging natural boundaries and limitations. As a child of his time, Marx did not discuss any limits to the human capacity to exploit nature for human well-being. Today, many people from diverse cultural backgrounds and living all over the world know that humanity is destroying the natural world. They seek leaders who will exercise their authority in the ways that educate citizens so they will choose to limit their desires and will find ways to use renewable resources to meet necessary needs. They will also create a climate of honor and dishonor that will give social respect to citizens who live moderately and disrespect to those who use excess resources. If these two methods fail, they might have to resort to using force. The world citizens should recognize that if they choose moderation now, they will avoid the need for more authoritarian leaders later. When leaders are given authority or take it to address an emergency situation, they are much more likely to abuse their power. Further, by denying any sense of a higher power, Marx gave political leaders absolute power. Instead of the rhetoric of God's will, corrupt politicians could use the rhetoric of the people's will and continue to oppress the majority of the people. Aristotle claimed that the art of statecraft is the act of weaving together the rich and the poor in many, many ways, so that any given society at any given time will have the largest and most stable middle class, making it possible for the greatest number of citizens to cultivate their capabilities. Today, in the formation of a global civilization, the great statesperson will point out that any religious tradition worthy of respect promotes the golden rule and other character traits that lead to the cultivation of the capabilities of everyone. And Aristotle's list of virtues is a good starting point. Further, any secular humanist that is truly humanistic will require all leaders, especially those with political and economic power, to do what is necessary to promote the capabilities of all. The practice of statecraft today should focus on the capabilities model as a natural and universal model that will not undermine the basic theological and philosophical beliefs of citizens anywhere in the world. A statesman will not accept beliefs that promote some citizens' capabilities over others in the name of religion or any other philosophy. Statesmanship might require the toleration of such intolerant beliefs in order to avoid authoritarian rule, but citizens should recognize the harm such beliefs could cause if they are linked to the exercise of political and economic power. Today, citizens living in previously communist nations have reacted differently to the opportunity to develop the capability of formulating a worldview, either philosophically based or religious. As long as citizens exercise the virtues and live moderately, rulers ought to give citizens free choice in the cultivation of a worldview within a climate of free intellectual inquiry. The premise of this paper is that Aristotle's list of virtues and vices, personal, social, and political, and his description of good laws and statesmanship in his ethical and political works, presents readers with a good starting point for developing a universal standard for living well, ruling well, and structuring a society. Further, Aristotle's view should be expanded to include Plato's dialogues, Homer, Greek mythology, other texts of Greek education, Thucydides' history, because these texts promote the cultivation of the same basic virtues and the importance of avoiding the vices connected with each one. So I'll save another video for the rest of this paper because I can't finish it.